Okay, well, good afternoon again. Welcome to our final panel for this event on North Korean human rights in the UN mechanism. And we really have to give it up to the last panel. And when you have the next generation, the youth in the room, you get a lot stronger reception, and it's a tough act to follow with celebrities like actor Yoo Ji-tae and some of our champions of North Korean human rights from the defector community. But this is a very important topic because a lot of the championing of North Korean human rights happens at the United Nations. And as an institution, the UN has been instrumental in elevating and magnifying the issue of North Korean human rights globally. This includes the work of the UN Special Rapporteurs and also several UN human rights committees that have encouraged, challenged, and pressed North Korean officials to improve human rights in their own country, while also advocating justice and accountability for victims. So our panel this afternoon addresses the important role and existing challenges the UN system faces in advancing North Korean human rights. So joining me on the stage are four distinguished guests from the UN community and also partner organizations from civil society. So please just allow me to briefly introduce our panelists before we get to questions. So I'll begin with my immediate left. We have Dr. Elizabeth Salmon. She's a professor of international law at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru and currently the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. To her left is Dr. Benyan Dawit Mesmer. He's a professor of international human rights law at the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. Since 2012, Professor Mesmer has been serving on the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child and served as its chairperson from 2015 to 2017. We then have Dr. Hae-sun Shin. She heads a human rights NGO that has ECOSOC consultative status, the Korea Center for United Nations Human Rights Policy. She also served as an expert on the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women from 2001 to 2008, and also a commissioner of the National Human Rights Commission of Korea from 2005 to 2008. And then we have, finally, Mr. Greg Scarlatu. He's the executive director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, otherwise known as HRNK. It's a position that he's held for 13 years. And he's also a Radio Free Asia Korean columnist, and he's been doing that for 21 years. And I just realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm Andrew Yo. I'm a senior fellow and the Korea chair at the Brookings Institution. I'm also a professor of politics at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. So now that we have the introductions aside, let me just jump to our first question. I wanted this to be more of an interactive dialogue or a conversation rather than having the panelists give speeches. So with apologies, because I know that several of them actually had formal presentations, but as many have done today, they've kind of chucked those in. So we'll just have a conversation about the role of the United Nations and where we can be heading moving forward on the question of human rights. And so let me just first turn to Dr. Salmon. So the ongoing conflicts in the Ukraine, the Middle East, and Africa, and the return of the so-called bloc politics has really put a strain on global governance, including the work of the United Nations. I think Justice Michael Kirby talked about trying to find areas where we can sting North Korea, but really China and Russia have taken out some of that sting and what the UN can do. So I wanted to ask you how these broader geopolitical trends directly or indirectly affect your work at the United Nations as it pertains to the human rights situation in North Korea. So I'll start with that.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm Elizabeth, no Dr. Salmon. Well, let me start by saying that I'm deeply grateful to the Minister of Unification, Human Asia, and obviously CSIS for inviting me to this conference on the situation of human rights in North Korea. For me, it is absolutely inspiring to see so many actors around the world, different countries, coming together to discuss on the situation of human rights in the DPRK. I am today here in Washington, but I have been in Seoul, in different countries, even in Argentina, and it is so inspiring to see different communities. I have a huge sense of responsibility because there is a strong community of experts, of wonderful people working around this. Yesterday, Julie Turner said that we need young people, and I totally agree, of course, but even if I'm not a young person, I feel like a young person here because you've spent decades working on the situation of human rights in the DPRK and just started in 2022. So I'm coming back to your question, no worries. I would like first to say that what about the international community and their efforts on the DPRK, and also maybe some information concerning my mandate and its priorities, as you said. Firstly, it is important to remember that the human rights situation in the DPRK has been a concern for the international community for the past decades. Both the Human Rights Council, but also the General Assembly have an annual resolution on the human rights situation in the past 20 years. I know that this is not enough, but we need to acknowledge that it happens in the international community. Secondly, one of these resolutions was in 2004, and it created the mandate on the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the DPRK. I'm the fourth mandate holder. We had Bitit Munterbong as the first one. Marzuki Darusman already quoted this morning, and Tomás Ojea Quintana as three special rapporteurs, so I am the fourth one. From the very beginning of my mandate, I felt a lot of pressure to do something different, so amazing. So I decided to have a slightly different approach, and I decided to focus on specific groups in the DPRK. So maybe some of you know that I started by the situation of women and girls in the DPRK. Not only because I am a woman, but because the DPRK has a number of obligations concerning women and girls, and also because there is an urgent situation that requires our attention. But additionally, I want to say that focusing on specific groups allowed me to strengthen networks around the DPRK. For instance, the committee, the CEDAW committee, the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, I don't know if you have heard of this, in 2023 recommended to China in their report to provide protection and ensure justice to women and girls from the DPRK. And we had a conference in Seoul talking about this. Also, the Special Rapporteur on the Violence Against Women and Girls raises this issue in different talks, the Working Group of Enforced Disappearances, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. So I don't want to bother you with all of this information, but I think that it is important to see that when we have a specific focus, we may have different actors around the table and we can strengthen synergies. And I don't know how many minutes I'm talking.
You're fine.
Fine? Okay, so may I use
Yes.
1 minute more? Yes. And concerning priorities, I wrote a report last year for the General Assembly in 2023 concerning the link between human rights, peace, and security to the General Assembly. I'm totally convinced that the path to sustainable peace demands engagement and full respect of human rights. The Security Council has held 6 formal meetings on the situation of human rights. I had the opportunity to brief the Security Council in March 2023 and in June 2024. And this is important because the Security Council recognizes that the situation of human rights in the DPRK poses a threat to international peace and security. So we cannot avoid this important step. And I want to finish this by saying that I think that extreme militarization in the DPRK, I wrote that in my report, but I want to repeat it because it is important to remember that. In DPRK, the extreme militarization is not explained without massive and serious human rights violation, not only because diverts enormous resources to implement human rights, but also because extreme militarization is based on forced labor inside and outside the DPRK. And finally, because it is a good pretext to strengthen surveillance over its people. So I think that the link between human rights, peace, and security is a strong tool, and I'm very happy to listen that this is discussed in different environments.
Thanks so much. And I think we will just go by our first names, as Elizabeth suggested, to reflect the collegiality of our community. And one thing I do want to point out is I actually read your first press statement, and you talked about wanting to have a victim-centered approach. And I think that's so important, especially because we're coming from out of the pandemic. There wasn't as much attention to North Korean human rights in Korea or elsewhere during this pandemic period. And I think you focusing on victims and particular groups like women, children, that's so important. And that gets me to my next question, and maybe if I can turn to Benyam and Hesu to talk about children and women in North Korea. And those who don't follow North Korean human rights closely might be surprised to hear that North Korea has ratified 5 human rights treaties. This includes the International Covenants of Civil and Political as well as Economic and Social Rights. But North Korea has also signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So it may seem surprising that North Korea actually has signed onto these agreements, these treaties related to human rights of particular groups. So I wanted to turn to you first, Benyam, and to talk about children, an area that a group that you've focused on for more than a decade. But what do you think prompted North Korea to sign conventions related to the rights of the child? Has the North Koreans ever responded to any requests from information from the committees? What are your thoughts here? What may have made North Koreans gravitate towards this issue, and are they actually responding in any sort of positive way to the treaties that they've been obligated to adhere to?
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm based in South Africa, as you heard, but I'm Ethiopian. And because of that historical connection between Ethiopia and South Korea, I've learned quite a lot from some extended family members within my own family. And this is probably the best opportunity that I've had the chance to meet more people at the same time from South Korea. Now, as was mentioned, I serve on the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. We often do disclaimers, so I don't want anything that I say to be taken to be representing the views of the committee, but let me throw a few ideas here. In 2017, I was still serving as chairperson of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child when we had the opportunity to engage with... Okay, in 2017, I had the opportunity, February 2017, I had the opportunity to engage with multiple civil society organizations working on human rights issues in North Korea. I was still chair of the committee at that stage, and then a few months down the line, as a committee, we also had the opportunity to review the state party report of North Korea. Now, there are a few things that I remember from that process. That was the 5th report of North Korea. So usually some of the expectations that you would have are, if you've gotten to the 5th report level, you need to be moving beyond the conversations about legislation, but predominantly on implementation, predominantly on quality, predominantly on progress. And there were a few areas where there was that, and there were significant areas where that was not present. In fact, I look back at the composition of the delegation. There were 10 members of the delegation. 4 of the 10 were from the permanent mission in Geneva. There were a couple of professionals from the legal department, and 1 from education and 1 from health. And there were significant areas where we couldn't engage in a detailed conversation, for instance, on data collection, which is absolutely critical, issues pertaining to law enforcement, issues related to children that are deprived of their liberty, and in the juvenile system, there was hardly, from the conversation, there wasn't anything that can be classified as being significant in terms of being a juvenile justice system. So those were some of the points. Now, why the government ratified? They provided in their initial report in 1996 saying that, they saw that the principles are very much, the principles of the convention are very much aligned with what they believe in, what they wish for their own children, that they said that there are actually expressions in North Korea that say a child is a king, should be given all privileges that are given to a king. And so quite a bit of aspirational thinking when the ratification came to force. Now, I just want to throw 2 points here. One is, as a committee, when we engage with states, there are always pros and cons. There is always room for improvement. One of the striking thing from the conversation that we had with North Korea in 2017 were some very serious human rights, child rights issues that were actually being contested, that we consider to be settled, but were being contested. For instance, issues pertaining to torture. That's not a topic that you can sort of contest and say, no, I agree here. Torture is torture. So there were serious concerns related to torture. There were serious concerns around the definition of a child, for example. When a question is posed, who does the Convention on the Rights of the Child apply to? The answer is the Convention applies to a child, by definition a person below the age of 18. But by looking at the legislation that was in place at that stage, a definition of a child was a person below the age of 16. So there were children that were falling between the cracks because according to domestic legislation, they were not covered as far as protection is concerned. And the third and important element which has been coming up yesterday and today is obviously accountability. We had raised a number of questions pertaining to accountability in terms of finances, in terms of data, in terms of individual accountability for violations. We had raised questions about the treatment of children that were forcibly returned. In many of those instances, those issues that were considered to be sensitive, responses were not coming. And when the responses were coming, they were not convincing. It's not because I say so. You can look at the concluding observations that actually keep on saying, in many occasions, that say, recalling its recommendation from the previous review, which were not addressed when we were busy reviewing the State Party report in 2017.
If I can ask a quick follow-up question, as by means of trying to advance this issue forward. The North Koreans have domestic law, as you mentioned, that talk about how they should treat children. Children are actually supposed to be venerated in North Korea. They, I think, do have an elevated status in theory, but in practice, we know that's not the case. So would it be possible to actually use North Korea's own domestic laws about what they say of children to press them to actually do what their own laws say, if that makes sense?
It makes absolute sense. And my answer to that is yes, but with some limitations. So let me just give you a few examples from that conversation that we had in 2017. There was the law on disaster prevention, rescue and recovery that was adopted by the government in 2014. The law on the protection of persons with disabilities, the law on farms and agriculture that were amended to address food problem and further increase the agricultural output. There was obviously the DPRK law on the protection of the rights of the child, which was adopted in 2010. The ordinance on enforcement of universal 12-year compulsory education. So there was a very long list of laws that our attention was drawn to during the conversation. Now, from the conversation, it was also evident that some of the laws are good, and they were, of course, presenting them as good. There were a number of laws that had significant limitations. I mentioned the example on the definition of a child, on juvenile justice, on the definition of torture, the treatment of children in orphanages, and so forth. There were significant limitations in those laws. But even in the instances where the laws were in compliance with the majority of the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, implementation was not forthcoming. There were significant limitations. And as we often say as a committee, we are as good as the information base that is at our disposal. And information that is accurate, that is up to date, was one of the struggles that we actually had to contend with when we were busy reviewing the State Party report of North Korea.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like one area that we can maybe make progress is collecting more information about children in North Korea, getting more information so that we can move forward with implementation.
I agree with you, and I think that if I can latch on to that, data collection, particularly disaggregated data collection, was one of the significant challenges that we faced during the review. In fact, if you go to the UNICEF website, it actually identifies data collection as being one of the priorities, where there has been some progress in certain sectors, but still significant limitations exist. And it's not just only general data collection. We are interested in disaggregated data on the basis of geography, on the basis of gender, on the basis of a whole range of economic status, and so forth, so forth. So that as a committee, we have a good look and feel of what the progress has been, what the limitations have been. And in fact, this year is the 35th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In fact, North Korea said that they ratified the optional protocol on sale, child prostitution, and child pornography in 2014 as the 25th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, in the occasion of that. Maybe the 35th anniversary is a good opportunity, not just to ask for more ratifications, that could also be done, but maybe to ask for more implementation of what has been ratified. And part of that is getting solid information, which also includes disaggregated data.
So I'm sure there are graduate students or young researchers out there. This is a perfect topic for you to explore. You have a professor here that you can consult and if you have any questions. But thank you so much for your comments, Binyam. Hesu, I want to follow along this same thread, just asking what your thoughts are about why the North Koreans decided to sign the treaty on the status of women. But also, just for you to help us unpack just the different narratives that come out about the role of women in North Korea. Because on the surface, you can see that women are visible in politics and society. There are many women in leadership position in North Korea. But at the same time, from defectors' testimonies, we hear so many horrific stories about the way women are treated. In the previous panel, we talked a little bit about women as well, too, and some of the abuses that they suffer from. And so can you help us unpack or square these two contradictions about how we see women, the way that the regime portrays women in these elevated positions, but at the same time, so many just horrific stories about how they're treated and denigrated. If you can just say a few things about that.
Thank you, Andrew, very much. Good afternoon. In this room, during the previous session, there was a feel of, full of hopes and shouting and etc. And now we are cooling down, down to the reality, dealing with the human rights system, how we can engage North Korea to really abide by the international norms. I have the experience of more than 30 years of engaging with the North Korean authorities when I was raising the issue of military sexual slavery by Japan, so-called comfort woman issue. So I regularly, encountered the North Korean authorities. We worked together, collaborated, and then I became the member of the CEDAW Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination of Women. And when you ask Andrew why North Korea ratified this Women's Convention, which was in 2001, which was somewhat rather late, considering that North Korea is a socialist country. Most of the socialist countries ratified it early in the 80s, because the convention was made in 1979. And I think it is because of the great impact at the time of the Beijing World Conference on Women, which happened in 1995. And then in 2000, there was a special session of UN General Assembly dealing with 5-year implementation of the policy document, Beijing Platform for Action. So each country was invited to report how much each country has implemented the Beijing Platform. And at the time, the North Korean ambassador spoke. Every country was given 7 minutes, the head of a delegation, to deliver at the General Assembly hall in the UN headquarters. And the North Korean ambassador was declaring that in North Korea, in DPRK, because after we adopted new constitution, there is no discrimination against women. He just declared. And then he bombarded his attack on Japan regarding the comfort woman issue, how hideous crime it is, the comfort woman system as a violence against women, etc. So at the time I attended and listened to his speech, and I approached him, congratulated him, and then I pointed out that, by the way, DPRK did not ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination of Women. And he said, oh, it doesn't matter, because there is no discrimination. It doesn't matter whether we ratify the convention or not. So I said, if you say it doesn't matter, why don't you ratify? And then the next year, it ratified. Of course, they didn't ratify it because of my challenge. But I was happy because in 2001, I was on the committee. And they submitted the initial report on time, but it was reviewed only as late as 2005, their initial report. And I was happy to see them because at that time, unlike at the time of the Beijing +5 General Assembly special session, they acknowledged that women in North Korea was discriminated. And I asked several questions to the delegation, including that women are not getting enough grams of rice at the time. But the delegation officially thanked the food assistance from Republic of Korea. And I also questioned why women who were trafficked, who went to China in search of food, when they returned, why were they imprisoned? And then the delegation said that, well, after 1998, they were no longer punished. It's a somewhat kind of lie. But anyway, there was a slow progress between what they have declared before and the time when they were examined by the committee. And your question regarding, it seems like women in North Korea are taking playing active role in political position. Actually, that's not true. It looks like they are because there is a foreign minister, Choi Sun-hee, as the highest woman. But actually, what we see from North Korea is a sort of Confucian socialism, because there were exchanges between North Korean group of women, South Korean women, and Japanese groups. So there was exchange early 90s. And when we asked the North Korean group of women who came to South Korea as early as 1991, we asked them, what is most impressive to you? And we were expecting, maybe the economic prosperity, etc. But their answer was, well, the way women talk back to their husbands, to men, because it's unthinkable. So it is a sort of socialism, but not as advertised by other socialist countries. Women are liberated, can take, everything else. But they are in the second-class position. And I think that is still that, despite of the law that they adopted. So nowadays, women are taking more active role in family and society, especially because of the collapse of the distribution system, because of the hunger and the food crisis. Women, as breadwinners now of the North Korean households, they take more active role. They have to bear the burden because their husbands do not bring any salary to their home. So there is a slight improvement in their recognition of their status in the family and society. But they are overburdened, they are exploited, and then all this sexual violence, sexual harassment, all this sexual abuse is really just as remain, as well as domestic violence. So I think there is a great need that we should bring this issue to the international arena either through UPR as well as other treaty body system.
And so you preempted one of my questions because we do hear how from defector women that there's more role for them, that they are the breadwinners, and whether that's changed their status at all. But it seems like despite women bearing more of the burden, the financial burden in their families, it hasn't really changed their status all that much. It hasn't been significant, and we still have these same problems. We'll come back to maybe this question in the Q&A, but let me now turn to my good friend Greg Scarlett too. So I know that your organization has played an important role in providing expert knowledge and helping set the agenda on North Korean human rights for decades. I know your reports have been extremely helpful for my own research. And your organization has also received consultative status from the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and this has been ongoing since 2018. So for those that may be less familiar with this relationship between the UN and civil society, can you explain what that status entails, and more importantly, how has that partnership helped with the UN advance their cause for advocating North Korean human rights?
Thank you, Andrew. Certainly it was more difficult for us than it was for Dr. Shin Hye-soo's group to acquire consultative status. There are currently 3 organizations dealing with DPRK human rights in consultative status: HRNK, us, PS Core, Dr. Kim Tae-hoon in South Korea, and very recently NKDB, the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights. What are the advantages? There are some practical advantages. You can issue your own credentials. You can host your own side events in collaboration with UN member states. It's very important that you elevate your profile. You can make statements, joint statements, together with other accredited NGOs. For example, in 2022, believe it or not, as an ode to sometimes the nonsensical nature of the United Nations, North Korea had the presidency of the Nuclear Disarmament Conference in Geneva. So we co-signed a letter initiated by UN Watch, a letter co-signed only by NGOs in consultative status. Of course, you can give a 2-minute statement at the UPR, Universal Periodic Review Interactive Dialogue. In 2019, our UPR submission was focused on detention facilities, on the Songbun system of, loyalty-based social discrimination, also on freedom, the lack of freedom of movement, in particular, lack of freedom of movement affecting women. This time around, we have recently submitted under the UPR process, again, detention facilities, also POWs, South Korean POWs, Japanese and Korean abductees and others, and South Koreans held against their will. We submitted under, our opinion on these topics. Donors like the fact that you have consultative status. Donors also like the fact that you prevailed against all odds. What am I trying to say here? Well, North Korea is part of a global struggle, a deepening global rift between status quo democratic UN member states, us, the European Union, the Republic of Korea, Japan, and others, and autocracies that are challenging the status quo, revisionist powers, in particular Russia, China, and their allies. In order to prevail in this titanic global struggle, and in order to define the history of the 21st century, we need international civil society. International civil society needs access to the UN system. Who holds the key to the UN system? Well, the NGO committee established under ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. So what is the composition of the NGO committee? So there are basically 19 member states, 5 from Africa, 4 from Asia, 2 from Eastern Europe, 4 from Latin America and the Caribbean, and 4 from Western Europe and other states. What happened to us? We were getting postponed over and over and over and over again. That's what happens. They keep you on hold for 5, 10, 15, 20 years until you retire or die. So we happen to have an ambassador at the UN, Ambassador Nikki Haley, who knew one of our board members very well, Jack David, who's now co-chair. Jack asked, do you have an ask? I said, yes, consultative status. So it was Ambassador Haley and Ambassador Kelly Curry, who was ECOSOC ambassador, who made it their mission. US-UN pushed really hard in collaboration with the European Union and the Canadians. Of course, we had to do our job too, talk to both friends and allies. We were brought up in the NGO committee. They shut us down. Why? Because it was dominated by the Russians and the Chinese. The Russians are out now because of the war in Ukraine. They're out of the Human Rights Council as well, temporarily. But again, the membership of the NGO committee is not exactly great. These are not beacons of human rights or democracy, most of them, right? So the current membership includes Algeria, Cameroon, Eritrea, Liberia, Zimbabwe, Bahrain, China, India, Pakistan, Chile, Costa Rica, Cuba, Nicaragua, Armenia, Georgia, Israel, Turkey, the UK, and the United States. We're in the minority. And this, my dear ladies and gentlemen, these are the UN member states that hold the key to access to the UN. What did US-UN do? The same that had been done before for Christian Solidarity Worldwide and other organizations. The NGO committee recommended that we get shut down and benched for 3 years. The decision was overturned in the larger 54-member meeting of the ECOSOC. So they went against the recommendation of the NGO committee. It's the only way to do it. It's very risky. We succeeded. Who voted against us? I still remember who they are. Russia, China, Venezuela, Cuba, Belarus, Vietnam, and I'm sorry, South Africa. I know, from South Africa, you just teach there. So,
he claims he's Ethiopian.
You're from Ethiopia. No, I'm sorry. No disrespect to any of these UN member states. It's a statement of fact. So what do we need? We need South Korea and Japan and like-minded states to take a hard look at the NGO committee. We have South Korean government representatives in the audience today, right? Okay, I know how it's done. You have consultation amongst multiple government agencies. What are our priorities? Where do we want representation at the UN? Okay, maybe the Human Rights Council, Security Council, yes, non-permanent member. Okay, maybe ILO. The NGO committee is not a priority for our South Korean friends or our Japanese friends. Please, 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 make it a priority. We're all, lamenting about, oh my goodness, crimes against humanity, perhaps genocide. Look at what's happening, what civil society do. Well, international civil society needs access to the UN. And the way to do it is to change the membership one member at a time. We can talk about African members, we can talk about Eastern European members, so generally okay, Latin American members. As far as South Korea is concerned, let's keep Asia in focus. Please, please, please consider membership in the NGO committee a priority. This is extraordinarily important. I know it's an internal process. I know it takes attention and resources to be distributed internally. But, I think that we're all in agreement that we do want like-minded UN members of the United Nations to adopt a more proactive role in this regard.
I think this gets back to a theme that was raised in the first session. I believe it was Elaine that made this point about making sure that we have we're building the networks for North Korean human rights, whether it's like-minded partners like the Japan, the South Koreas, the EU, other middle powers, and also the global South. And so I think building that network is really crucial. The other reaction or thought I had when you were speaking, Greg, is that we always say that human rights knows no politics, but it is even just to get membership to ECOSOC, it sounds extremely political, and I guess that's just the reality of the environment that we live in. It's only getting more difficult because of the geopolitics, because of where Russia is at, where China is at today. Now, the United Nations is one of the few mechanisms by which North Korea remains engaged to the international community. Even though it's a very thin level of engagement, nevertheless, it's one of the international organizations that they're a member to. And so we don't want to give up on whatever ground that the UN has made. We don't want to give up. We want to keep pushing. I'm going to answer my own question in that I don't think in recent years, though, that there have been any cases where the North Koreans have actually listened to any of the recommendations that have been coming to them. I know when you ask, well, what has North Korea done on human rights? People cite actions that North Koreans had taken in 2014 or 2001 when they signed, when they agreed to sign on to the Treaty of the Status of Women. But recently, post-COVID, there really hasn't been any movement. And so I wanted to ask, what tactics or what opportunities might be available to promote conversation with North Koreans? We've talked about pressure, we've talked about accountability, finding the sting to really push North Korea in a certain direction. But at the same time, we still want to have conversations with North Korea. That's where I fear maybe we're past that period, or it's not possible because of who's backing North Korea these days. But I did want to ask our panelists, and maybe we can begin with Elizabeth, or really anyone who has thoughts here, what are the tactics or opportunities we can use to try to promote dialogue with North Koreans on human rights?
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, well, the DPRK has been engaging with the human rights mechanism to a certain extent. There's no need to be so optimistic. But I would like to mention that in December 2023, so we are talking about maybe 6 months, the DPRK submitted written replies to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability on the initial state's report. So it was December 2023. I had the opportunity to meet with many people who work for the committee in Geneva. And let me assure that they are very eager to know, to have more information, to engage, to open the door for a briefing. So there are some movements. And the most important is that in November 2024, as has been mentioned, we have the 4th cycle of the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review. The deadline for the national report is on August the 5th, so in a few days. And the public version of this document, we need to translate it into the 6 official languages, but it will be public in the coming weeks. And I also want to remind that I am being encouraging member states to make the most of this next UPR with the DPRK. I think that we need sorry for that, but I think it is important to have USA, Japan, and of course the Republic of Korea. But what about the rest of the world? What about the rest of the world? We exist. So I've been trying to talk to Latin American states, for instance. We share stories about enforced disappearances. We share stories about torture. So I think that we need to broaden a little bit the actors, as I said before, around the table. Secondly, I want very quickly, Andrew, to say a few words around the victim-centered approach. It's true, it is part of my idea about human rights. And I wanted to mention the aging factor. Separated families, they are all becoming old people. So I think that we need to think about accountability, of course, but what can we do now with these victims that are aging? What can we do now for them? And I think, and I'm trying to work on that for my next report, that it is important for states that host victims to take full responsibility of these people, trying to provide compensation, economic and social support, psychosocial support for victims, the rate of suicides in different countries. So I wanted to let you know that I am totally for accountability, I'm totally for engagement, but I would also like to highlight a little bit the situation of victims around the world.
Thank you. There are others that'd like to respond?
Yeah, thank you very much. A very important question. Now, there are few areas where progress has been noted. It's not necessarily in the last 2 or 3 years. For example, there has been improvement in indicators of infant and under 5 mortality. That is, I think, good. But in the meantime, if you look at the challenge related to neonatal and maternal mortality, multi-drug resistance TB, or issues pertaining to children with disabilities and so forth, there are significant challenges. Now, having said this, if you look at the progress or the lack thereof in relation to civil and political rights as compared to economic, social, and cultural rights, civil and political rights are basically falling off the cliff. I don't think there will be data to support, to say, in relation to children, whether freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, even issues pertaining to child participation has actually seen progress in the last few years. Probably not. Now, the other point that I just want to flag is, I want to be a little bit critical in relation to what the UN stands for, what it can do in relation to human rights. If you look at the number of UN agencies, entities working in North Korea, FAO, WHO, UNDP, UNFPA, UNICEF, and so forth, how much of those organizations are actually doing human rights work? How many of those organizations are actually having human rights conversations with the leadership in North Korea? Within the UN system, we say there are 3 pillars. Development is one pillar, peace and security is another pillar, and human rights is the 3rd pillar. These days, more and more people, even within the UN system, they're saying human rights is not a pillar, it's a stick. If you want a clear example of that, look at the role that the UN agencies in North Korea are actually playing. How much role are they playing in relation to human rights conversations? That's important. The 3rd point that I just want to flag is, to what extent are we leveraging the SDGs to push the boundaries on human rights-related issues in North Korea? There are a number of, whether it's on education, whether it's on healthcare, whether it's on the rights of children with disabilities, the government, when they came to us in 2017, they said that there is no child labor in North Korea. That's not my words, their words. That's what they say, because they're giving some of these assignments as economic assignments at the school setting. So they don't classify those as being child labor. So the role that the SDGs can play to push the boundaries, to create a world fit for children, a country fit for North Korean children, is significant. But to what extent we are using that leverage remains to be an important conversation. Let me make a final point on the role of the UN. I already flagged earlier that 2014, the government used the 25th anniversary as an opportunity to ratify the optional protocol on sale, child prostitution, and child pornography. This year is the 35th anniversary. Within the UN system, maybe that might be an opportunity, but it's also important that we have that conversation in a more meaningful manner between the special rapporteur, with CEDAW, any of the other treaty bodies, so that there is some level of consistency, continuity, and some focus to create a country that is fit for children, but also that respects human rights of other stakeholders.
That's really excellent, Benyam, to really kind of push the envelope in terms of where we need to go and also to be self-critical about things that we haven't done yet. So thanks for sharing your insights. Hesu or Greg, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. I think my assessment of North Korea's engagement with the UN human rights mechanism has been, on one hand, somewhat doubtful, on the other hand, hopeful. Because North Korea has been selectively engaging with the UN system. They deny Human Rights Council or Security Council's resolution, and they leave the room, we object. But North Korea has been engaging with UPR up to this moment. And this year, we are expecting the 4th cycle of UPR, which is happening in November 7. Yeah, so I am coordinating with 9 NGO working on North Korean human rights, 7 from South Korea and 2 from Japan together. So we have already submitted report to the UPR in April. Yeah, and then this year there has been more because of our, more engagement in this UN mechanism. So there are altogether 21 reports submitted, which is much better than last cycle. So we will follow this up. We already had meetings with the foreign embassies based in Seoul, briefing them what issues needs to be brought by various member states. We will do it again in Geneva in August as well as in November, trying to raise the issues. North Korea has been very selective in responding to CEDAW, the Women's Convention, to the Children's Convention, to CRPD. Actually, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability, as Elizabeth has said, submitted replies to the list of issues. And then the committee is estimating to review the report next year, August next year. So we should work on that regarding the persons with disabilities. So I think we should keep trying to really let North Korea come out of their boxes, and then to really understand how this system works, to get along with this system. Yeah? But at the same time, we should also work towards together with other special procedure mandate holders, of course, Elizabeth, but also other special procedures like working group on business and human rights, working group on enforced disappearances, to submit individual complaints, as well as, asking the inquiry procedure, etc. So together, working within the one human rights system, one UN family system, I think we can bring some changes. And just one last comment regarding what Greg has raised regarding this consultative status. I myself helped 2 organizations register with the UN by NGO committee, my own organization, now Kokun, but also Korea Women's Associations United, and then there are many organizations. I think it is very important for organizations working on North Korean human rights issues to be registered. But even without registration, without consultative status, we can borrow the consultative status of already registered NGOs, which I have been done during the 1990s, borrowing and then helping, getting help from them to enter the UN premises. So I think we can all work together in whatever way we can possible, try to find ways to get this issue resolved, as much as we can, in whatever way we can.
So all the NGOs go to Greg if you need access or need.
Yeah, of course, yes. Dr. Shin Hye-soo, I was so tired of begging our colleagues for access. Please, can you include us in your delegation?
Greg, I'll give you the kind of last word before we open it up to questions. But
Andrew,
Greg,
3 points. Yeah. 1 tactical, very quickly, 2 strategic. Our co-chair emeritus, Roberta Cohen, will remind everyone that North Korea accepted a UPR recommendation by Ireland to allow humanitarian access to its detention facilities. They don't admit to the existence of the Kwaliso political prison camps, but they do admit to Kyohahyung, re-education through labor, and the Kyohaso, re-education through labor detention centers. We need to hammer that point. We included it in our UPR submission this year, in 2024. The other 2 points, Elizabeth, you've already made this point, actually. Glory to the UN member states that have driven significant measures on North Korean human rights. The United States, the European Union, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, they're all from the global north. We really need to involve the global south. Of course, I mean, some of you may disagree with the notion of a global north, global south. Anyway, developing countries, right? North Korea is not just a remnant, an extension of the non-aligned movement. No, it's a regime that commits crimes against humanity. And we need to talk to our friends and allies. We need to make new friends and allies, global south. Benjamin, you made a great point about the 3 pillars: humanitarian, political, human rights. At the UN, human rights is in the preamble of the UN Charter, as Justice Kirby always reminds us. Former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, a South Korean, was very keen on the concept of a human rights upfront approach, bringing together all 3 pillars of the UN. We have proceeded with a more liberal interpretation of the term. We have been promoting, HRNK, my organization, and others, a human rights upfront approach to the North Korean conundrum, meaning do not address only the ballistic missiles and the nuclear weapons, include human rights in the conversation, include human rights in any outreach, any diplomatic initiative concerning North Korea. without a human rights upfront approach, I think there is very little hope that we will resolve the other critical issues composing this North Korean conundrum.
Greg, I'm glad you brought up the human rights upfront approach in response to Benyam's points, because that's something I feel like that's been lost. I know there's a lot of attention to that, but it's been lost, and I think we need to raise that. And if you didn't mention it, I was pretty sure Roberta Cohen would have said something about it as well, too. The organizers said that we had a few extra minutes because we started late for questions. I know we're supposed to go until 1:40, but I'll extend it by 5 minutes. So are there any questions from the audience? And we'll collect them. And it has to be a question, not a statement or speech. So Roberta, Kim, yes, two. Is there, we'll collect. Okay, so we'll just start with those two.
Yes, I'm going to just zero in then on a question that has to do with children. If you look at a General Assembly resolution, you will see a listing of some of the vulnerable children in North Korea. Those are not the same categories that are used by UN agencies. For example, homeless children, for example, children who are detained, for example, children whose parents are detained, and there are more. There's a gap between that definition in the GA resolution and what UNICEF considers vulnerable, because they have to deal in North Korea, and the fear of expulsion by these organizations is high. But I wonder how the Committee on the Rights of the Child, what kind of categories do you look at? Do you also exclude the kind of groups that a UN agency would without directly ever saying so?
Hold that thought, and then Mr. Lee.
I have a question to Ms. Elizabeth Salmon. Through the media and press, if I look at your report, you can see that you are a very brave person. Well, I lived in North Korea for 57 years, and I spent 30 years working very close to the leadership. So I know that who is behind all this North Korean human rights situation. I do have insights on that. So we can see many people are appealing to emotion. We have academic discussion on this issue. However, I think the best way to resolve this issue is that this Kim family has been there for 80 years now. We need to stop them from there. I mean, we need to hold them accountable. There should be accountability that is sought. I listened to your remark, Ms. Elizabeth. This dictator, we need to bring him to the international trials. I want to know if it is really possible.
You can answer first, and then Elizabeth, you can answer next.
Thank you very much for that question, but also for noticing it. Now, my reaction would be that, as the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, we're independent. Yes, we're voted in as independent experts. We don't go back and report to our countries that we come from and so on. So, and resolutions, be it at the General Assembly or Human Rights Council, they're very political. For anyone who follows the Human Rights Council, words like, if you say evidence-based, there will be countries that will raise their hands and say, no, we don't want that word evidence-based because it's being used to exclude certain categories of civil society organizations that are not doing research on the ground. Even gender-based violence, some of the words that you think that are actually settled, they've been politicized. As the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, we don't really have those limitations. One of the advantages that we also have is that we engage in consultation both publicly but also in closed session. So we speak to the civil society organizations, we speak to the UN agencies. What the UN agencies are able to put outside in public as compared to what they will be able to say in private, obviously some level of confidentiality goes a long way in allowing them to express some of the challenge that they face. I have not had the chance to look at those categories, but if you go and look at our 2017 concluding observations as the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, we've actually touched on all those categories that you've mentioned and more. In fact, I'll go one extra mile. We didn't get a lot of input, for instance, on children that are executed for offenses that they committed while they're below the age of 18. Just 1 hour ago, we heard on this podium that children for offenses that they committed while below the age of 18, they would wait until they turn 18 and they're actually being executed. You might not get this information from UN agencies, less so in a public statement. But of course, in the closed conversations, in the confidential sittings, you get as much input as you need to be able to be empowered to engage with the state party. So we don't have those limitations, and I think, as I said, I know, if you look at our concrete observations, you'll get the sense that we covered the whole gamut. One final point that I just want to mention, I know I'm taking advantage of the opportunity to have the mic. There was a brief reference earlier today about suicide, and you kindly mentioned the issue about suicide. In 2019, the UNICEF executive director at that stage, she talked about 8 reasons why she's concerned about the world's children and 8 reasons why she is hopeful. One of the 8 reasons that she talks about is that it should be okay to talk about mental health. Usually when we engage with children's rights in the context of North Korea, the civil and political rights issues, the sexual abuse, the torture and so forth, they seem to dominate the conversation, and mental health seems to fall between the cracks. The Convention on the Rights of the Child places emphasis on mental health as well, and that's a very important topic to keep an eye on.
Did you want to?
So maybe very, very quickly, because I know that we finish, but only to say that I didn't have the chance to speak about accountability because I understood that the previous panels talk a lot about accountability. My last report to the Human Rights Council is absolutely dedicated to accountability, but I think there is a culture of impunity in the DPRK, and we need to face that. If we speak about human rights without accountability, it is like speaking only of half of the problem. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank our panelists here, but because we're wrapping up now, I wanted to say just a couple things, so just in 2 minutes. First, there's a saying that says that the night is darkest before the break of dawn, and I was at that conference 10 years ago when there was a snowstorm. I think I was actually sitting at the table over there, and we felt that there was something that's going to happen because of this UN COI report. 2024, the situation seems actually worse, not better, especially because of the geopolitical environment. When we meet again in 10 years, we should be celebrating. It means we have to all work much harder to make progress on North Korean human rights. So I hope we can all move in that direction. And lastly, I just want to thank several people. First, CSIS and their staff, Andy, Seon, Ellen, Minji, the army of interns I'm always jealous that you guys have here. Also Human Rights Asia, Poya Kim and his staff, and then also the Ministry of Unification for really having the foresight to put together this event. So I think all of those people deserve a round of applause. So thank you once again for joining us for the 2024 International Human Rights Dialogue on North Korean Human Rights.